In 1785, George Washington was loving his retirement. He had moved back to Mount Vernon, which after so many years on campaign had run into financial problems. Washington was surprisingly okay with that. He was super into agricultural science and used the state of his plantation to experiment with all the hip new techniques that the other planters of Northern Virginia were using to try and increase their output. But his biggest interest was canal building. He loved the idea of a canal that would link the headwaters of the Ohio and the Potomac rivers. He had this vision that the town of Alexandria nearby would become a gateway to the West, and frankly, he would not stop talking about it. But he did have a point. The Mississippi was still closed to American merchants, which had slowed settlement to the region. At the same time, the states had built up trade barriers around themselves, which made it harder to do business with each other. Maryland and Virginia, who both shared the Potomac River, decided to hold a conference in Alexandria to discuss cooperating on trade rather than keeping up their barriers. And maybe even a little project like a canal. A canal, you say? Washington liked being retired, but he was so desperate to talk about canals that he insisted that the commissioners meet at his estate instead of in town. The Mount Vernon Conference saw some really promising results. Maryland and Virginia saw that cooperating on trade was in their common interests. Toward the end, they decided, hey, maybe we should do this every year. You know, we should invite Delaware next time. And while we're at it, how about Pennsylvania too? I mean, the Chesapeake and the Delaware are just begging for a canal, wouldn't you agree? Virginia decided that if they're gonna do it, they might as well go all in. They invited all 13 states to a convention in Annapolis, Maryland the following year. They were supposed to discuss matters of interstate trade and only interstate trade. The rest of the country had the same problem as Maryland and Virginia. A couple years of economic depression and trade restrictions from Britain and Spain were forcing the states to look into cooperating with each other. Okay, pause here. It's really important to note that this was all being done without the Confederation Congress, and coincidentally, it was some of the most productive interstate cooperation that had been seen since the war. What they were doing wasn't technically illegal, but keep it in the back of your mind that they're getting comfortable with bending the rules. Okay, unpause. James Madison was chosen as one of the delegates who would attend. In fact, the whole idea of inviting all 13 states was his idea in the first place. But usually when he had a good idea like this, he would just let someone else take the credit for it so he could stay behind the scenes. He basically locked himself in his room with a bunch of history books about leagues and confederacies and the reasons why they all failed. The purpose of the convention was to talk about trade, but he was preparing an argument against the idea of a confederation in general. When September of 1786 rolled around, Madison arrived at the convention where a whopping 2 people were present. After waiting for a few days to begin, there were only 12 people there. It was turning out to be a disaster. The convention was taking place in Annapolis, yet Maryland hadn't even sent any delegates. Others had gotten cold feet, and a few more were just taking a really long time to get there. The delegates that were most eager to get there all agreed with Madison that interstate commerce was just a symptom of the underlying problem. The Confederation wasn't working. Reading the room, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison decided to see if they were cool with just canceling the whole Annapolis convention and calling a new one. The next convention would meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787. The topic would be fixing all the problems of the Articles of Confederation, not just interstate commerce. Now we start going further into that legal gray area. Congress never said that they were allowed to do this, but never mind that, they didn't even have a quorum yet. They were just 12 dudes sitting in a room. Was the convention that they called even legal? The Virginia Assembly reasoned that to go over the Confederation's head was the whole point of a weak federal government, right? And if push came to shove, what could they even do to stop it? Virginia endorsed the Philadelphia Convention. The governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, had actually been one of the 12 guys that had called the next convention, forwarded their endorsement to the 12 other state legislatures. The Virginia state legislature also unanimously decided that Washington should be one of their delegates to this new convention. If Washington came out of retirement to attend, it would be huge news and more people would take it seriously. But again, Washington was really enjoying his retirement, and going to Philadelphia during the convention would lead to some truly high school level drama. The Society of the Cincinnati, this group of Revolutionary War veterans, was also meeting in Philadelphia at the same time as the convention, and he really didn't want to have to talk to those guys. The Cincinnati wanted to make membership hereditary, which Washington saw as a step towards military aristocracy, so he had resigned as their leader. The situation would be just awkward and he wanted to avoid it. You might be thinking that's kind of a flimsy excuse, and James Madison thought so too. He asked Washington to at least let Virginia keep his name on the list of delegates. He didn't have to go, but just in case things started to get really bad, let's keep the door open. After all, if the Confederation fell apart, then his legacy was in real danger. This was pretty much Madison manipulating Washington because he knew that the only word that Washington liked more than canal was legacy. Washington knew that they were just trying to manipulate him, but they did have a point. So he ended up at least saying that he accepted his position as a delegate, but didn't say if he was actually going to attend. While all that drama was going on, he was receiving a steady stream of letters from the spiraling situation in Massachusetts. Shays' rebellion had turned violent, and a rebel army had appeared in the west of the state. The army was really only a few thousand, but in the papers it was inflated to 20, even 40,000 people. Letters from his friends like Henry Knox and David Humphreys also greatly exaggerated the severity of the rebellion. He received nothing but pessimistic news about the inevitability of Massachusetts being overthrown and the end of the Republic. It looked like his legacy was in jeopardy. People debate the exact degree that Shays' rebellion influenced the Constitution, but at the very least, it was yet another reason for Washington to attend. With Washington on board, at least on paper, more states began to elect delegates, all without the approval of Congress. Congressmen realized that the convention was going to happen with or without their approval, so they decided to get behind it, as long as the delegates kept in mind that the convention had the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want anyone doing anything crazy like proposing a new constitution or anything. Now the convention had a sound legal basis and more states elected delegates. By that spring, all the states except for Rhode Island had elected 70 delegates. It was starting to look like a legit convention. Knox and Humphreys in the army also assured Washington that the Cincinnati would love to have him back and there would be no hard feelings, and they'd let them sit at the same lunch table as them or whatever. Washington made up his mind. He would attend the convention, and spend some time with the Cincinnati to patch things up. Madison and the other Federalists filled Washington in on their plan to revise the Articles of Confederation with a brand new form of government. The stage was set for the Constitutional Convention.